Under Darius the Great, the Persian Empire is at the peak of its power. He commands an empire that stretches from the Balkans to the Indus Valley, larger than any in history up to that point. Yet, for all its might, this huge empire was plagued with troublesome revolts. Just a year earlier, the Ionian Revolt was extinguished only after 6 years of costly war. While the Persians were eventually victorious, Darius was infuriated with the open support the rebels received from across the Aegean. At this point in history, Greece was fractured among quarreling city-states, most of whom had deep ties with the Ionian Greeks. Athens, one of the most prominent of the Greek city-states, had garnered the wrath of Darius through their support for the Ionian rebels. Darius would seek to exact his revenge from those who would defy his rule. He ordered preparations for an invasion of Greece. Initially, the Persians began by re-subjugating Thrace, which had been conquered 30 years earlier. Macedon, an autonomous vassal under the Persians, was forced to become a fully subordinate client state. Thus, the stage was set for an invasion of mainland Greece. Before he began his campaign, Darius would send ambassadors to the Greek city-states, believing that none would oppose the might of the Persian Empire. When Darius demanded the Greek city-states to swear their loyalty, almost all of them obliged, with 2 striking exceptions. In Athens, the Persian ambassadors were put on trial and executed. In Sparta, the ambassadors were simply thrown down a well. Both sides began preparing for war. Darius, further outraged by the execution of his ambassadors, began assembling a large force to launch an amphibious expedition to swiftly and decisively crush the Greeks who opposed them. The Persian army was composed of various groups from within the vast empire. The tomb of Darius depicts 30 different ethnicities fighting in the Persian army, from Egyptians to Indians. Persian troops mainly fought as light infantry, generally armed with a bow, spear, sword, shield, and wore leather armor. They would use their bows to wear the enemy down from a distance, then deliver the fatal blow with spears and swords at close range. Meanwhile, the Athenians began their preparations by requesting help from fellow city-states. Despite all the hostility between them, Sparta pledged to join the war as allies. The city of Plataea also pledged its support. They would send 1,000 troops to fight alongside the Athenians. The backbone of the Greek armies was the hoplite, heavy infantry wearing armor made of bronze or thick linen, armed with long spears, large shields, and swords for close range. The principal way of fighting was in the phalanx formation, where the hoplites formed a shield wall and projected their spears forward. The phalanx presented a formidable threat to any enemy foolish enough to face it directly. Time will tell whether the hoplites will be able to hold their ground against a Persian onslaught. However, the odds would soon turn against Athens, as Sparta was thrown into political chaos. A scandal would result in the Spartan king Cleomenes being forced into exile, which he responded by gathering an army to force his return. Cleomenes would eventually die in prison. He would be succeeded by the soon-to-be legendary King Leonidas. Meanwhile, the political crisis deprived Athens of Spartan support. Darius would take advantage of this fact, and in 490 BC, the Persians would launch their invasion of Greece to finally punish Athens and Eretria. The Persians employed the strategy of island hopping, making their way through the Aegean islands while conquering them one at a time. They eventually reached Eretria, one of their primary objectives, and after a siege that lasted 6 days, the city was overrun. Eretria was plundered and its population forcefully deported to Persia. The Persians then sailed south, landing at Marathon, only 40 kilometers from Athens. Darius would soon have the opportunity to exact his revenge. Realizing their grave need for further support, the Athenians sent their greatest runner, Phidippides, to request aid from Sparta. He would reach Sparta the next day he left, running 225 kilometers in less than 2 days. He would not return with good news. The Spartans were celebrating the festival of Carnea, a sacred time in which no military expedition of any kind was allowed. The Athenians would have to face the Persians without Spartan support for at least 10 days. The Persians landed at Marathon with a force consisting of around 25,000 infantry, supported by 2,000 cavalry. The Athenians met them with the entirety of their army, 10,000 hoplites in all, with another 1,000 hoplites from Plataea soon arriving to join the Athenians. Despite this fact, they were still outnumbered more than 2 to 1. The stakes were high. Defeat would mean certain destruction for Athens. The fate of the city and Greece itself would be decided at Marathon. The Athenian army quickly moved to block the exits from Marathon, preventing the Persians from moving inland. The Athenians adopted a defensive stance, knowing that time was on their side, as each passing day brought the arrival of the Spartan reinforcements closer. It is unknown exactly why the Persians were also on the defensive. It's possible that the Persians were unwilling to face the hoplite phalanxes head-on. Neither side initiated a decisive battle for 5 days. The situation would soon change as the Greeks realized that the Persian cavalry was re-embarking on their ships, headed to sail around and attack Athens while the city was still defenseless. The Greeks could no longer afford to stay on the defensive. They had to take decisive action. The Greeks launched an all-out attack, charging down from their positions to meet the Persians in open battle. The Persians were caught by surprise to see the outnumbered and unsupported Greeks charging into battle. And finally, the hoplites made contact with the enemy. As the fierce melee went on, the strong Persian center began cutting their way through the Greek lines. On the flanks, the Greek hoplites began to prove superior against the lightly armed Persians. The Persian flanks first began to waver, then broke into a full rout. As hoplites closed in from the sides, the Persian center broke in panic and headed for their ships. Some of the ships were captured by the Greeks, though most of them managed to launch onto the sea. The Greeks may have won a stunning victory, but the war wasn't over yet. this fatigued army would have to march back to Athens to protect it from the Persians that were sailing around to attack. Since the entire Athenian army was at Marathon, Athens was left undefended. The Athenian hoplites, bearing their heavy equipment and armor and exhausted from battle, marched back to Athens at breakneck speed, just in time to beat the Persian fleet to Athens. When the Persians saw the Athenian army at Athens, they retreated without a fight. The Greek victory was now complete. The next day, the Spartan army finally arrived at Marathon. After touring the battlefield, they too realized that the Athenians had truly won a great victory. The Persians lost at least 6,400 men. The Greeks lost only about 200 men. And although these casualties are negligible considering the vast resources of the Persian Empire, for the Greeks it was an immensely significant victory. It shattered the belief that the Persians were invincible, and for the first time, the Greeks proved that it was possible to resist. It was also a defining moment for Athens. Many claimed it marked the beginning of the city's golden age. During this period, Athens would host great philosophers, statesmen, historians, and playwrights, the very foundation of Western philosophy and culture. The legend of Phidippides was conflated with the army's march back from Marathon. The modern marathon run first began in 1896, where athletes run the approximate running distance from Marathon to Athens. The more accurate and lesser known Spartathlon first began in 1983 and had runners go the entire distance between ancient Athens and Sparta. The current world record holder, dubbed Phidippides' successor, ran the 246-kilometer course in just 20 hours and 25 minutes. Marathon would not mean an end to Persian aggression. While the Greeks celebrated their victory, Darius did not waste any time grieving. He immediately began preparations to raise a huge army, planning to crush the Greeks with overwhelming numbers. And once again, the fate of Greece and the known world would be decided in battles that will eventually become legendary.